Welcome back to the International Symposium Art and Humanity, What is Possible? We are here at the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum, where we're still installing the new exhibition concerned 30 artists on humanitarian issues. My name is Pascal Hufschmid, I'm the director of the museum, and I'm here with Enckell Julliard, Director of Cultural Development at the Geneva Art and Design University.
Thank you for taking time to join us. This is the second session of our online symposium. Every Tuesday afternoon in May, we explore the complex and fascinating relationship between art and humanitarian action, two fields of expertise which seldomly interact with one another.
So last week, we listened to fascinating panelists on the theme of learning and how artists and humanitarian workers can learn from one another. Today, we're going to listen to three more panelists who are going to present various topics. And of course, throughout the presentations, please feel free to use the chat box, and we'll gather at the end of the three presentations for a live Q&A session.
Today's theme is engaging. How can artists and humanitarian workers actively engage with one another in the field? We will start with Sophia Milosevic Bijleveld, an independent consultant based in Geneva. In her paper, The Art of Memorialization, she analyzes how art-based memorialization practices can help head and reconcile individuals and societies affected by violence.
And we'll continue with Azadeh Sobout. She sheds light on the critical contribution of artists in the aftermath of the Beirut blast in August 2020. She is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Manchester.
And finally, Elodie Paillard will ask if ancient Greek theater can be used as a humanitarian tool. She is a lecturer at the University of Basel.
And today we'll continue our experiment with Swiss artist Gilles Furtwängler. You'll have another opportunity to take part in this co-created work of art during a 10-minute or so creative session with Gilles, who will join us later on. So we're going to listen to the different panelists, but first, Julie, you could tell us a little more about Gilles.
Yes, Gilles Furtwängler is an artist who's working with reading, writing, performance, and graphic arts. He's represented by Sophia Gallery in Geneva, and he has had a lot of exhibitions in Switzerland and abroad.
A big thank you again to all the speakers. We very much look forward to listening to them, and of course to you for taking the time to join us. So before we get started, Julie and I would like to thank our partner, Philippe Stoll, who is Senior Communication Advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross. I would also like to thank my colleague Pierre-Antoine Possard for the coordination and production of the online symposium. And you'll get to meet Philippe later on in the next session.
The symposium is the result of a partnership between the International Red Cross Museum, the RCRC, the Geneva Red Cross, and Head Geneva, the University of Art and Design. We would like to thank all our partners for their enthusiasm and support.
So it's now time to start. We look forward to listening to the three panelists of the day. Please make sure you use the chat box to ask any questions and take part in the co-created artwork with Gilles Furtwängler. We'll meet later on during the live panel at the end. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sophia Milosevic Bijleveld, and I'm delighted to be participating in the Art and Humanity Conference today. I want to start by thanking the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum, the Geneva Haute École d'Art et de Design, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the Geneva Red Cross for giving me the opportunity to discuss a topic that is close to my heart. I will give a brief presentation of three different memorialization approaches, and I look forward to your questions and our discussion afterwards. In post-conflict context, memory plays an important role in building lasting and sustainable peace. Reconstructing narratives of the past gives individuals a sense of closure and participate in the collective healing of the social fabric these individuals live in. Memorialization initiatives have multiplied around the world and participate in different mechanisms of reconciliation, healing, as well as civic engagement for both individuals and societies which have broken down due to violence. Memorialization is one of the very many forms that symbolic reparation can take. It has gained attention with the development of transitional justice around the world. A number of Truth Commission's reports recommend memorialization activities such as building monuments and museum rituals, renaming public facilities and official apologies as part of the broader symbolic reparation program. These initiatives can work towards goals that may not be addressed by mainstream transitional justice mechanisms. Indeed, memory and memorialization allow for the recognition of individual victims and survivors and their stories of the conflict. They allow different generations to understand the conflict and mediate between the past and the present. They allow the society collective space for mourning that can promote the process of healing past wounds. The element of truth-telling is central in the mechanism of transitional justice, whereby which a silent story and narrative is given its right place. For memorialization to have a profound effect on society and the non-recurrence of violence, it must be an inclusive, holistic process involving victims and survivors and be context-driven. Art and performative practices have been shown to be powerful vectors for victims' voices. This presentation will focus on 3 different art-based approaches to memorialization: body mapping, community-based theater, and memory boxes. Through these, we will see how art is articulated around memory and acts as a powerful ground for understanding the past and creating a meaningful dialogue, thus opening avenues for reconciliation. Body maps are pictorial representation of a person's life story in this life-size outline of the person's body. The purpose of the process is to enable unrecognized survivors a chance to express and remember their experience. They create a safe space for participants to remember and help in the healing of their past trauma. This psychosocial method was developed in South Africa out of the Memory Box project in 2002 that sought to help HIV/AIDS patients to prepare their passing and create a timekeeper and depository of memory for their children or families. Body maps stemmed out from this to address the stigmas faced by HIV/AIDS victims and acknowledge their illness not simply with the physical manifestation, but also as a way of representing the mental suffering linked to the illness. Beyond being a powerful tool for self-reflection and psychosocial support, body maps are used as research tools in terms of participatory qualitative method, as advocacy tools when displayed in exhibitions or publications, or as educational tools. In 2012, TICA, a Kenyan organization, worked with a group of 12 torture survivors who had been illegally detained and tortured at the Nyayo house. Body mapping was used to enable these torture victims to create life-size portraits that illustrate their life experiences. The infamous Nyayo house in central Nairobi served as a clandestine torture and detention center during the 1980s and the 1990s under the regime of President Moi. In a building that was used as a public service facility, prisoners were subjected to various forms of torture, including waterboarding and extreme temperature changes in their cells. The cells were found in the basement of the building, and the building continues to operate today. The body maps are developed with a selected group during a workshop usually lasting 5 days. During the workshop, the survivors are gradually made to feel safe, thus enabling them to start sharing their painful stories of trauma and loss, as well as their hopes, aspiration for the future, and enable them to reflect on the support structures that they have developed through the years. All these are expressed through the use of art, drawing, and painting, with the help of one or more facilitator. Over the course of the 5-day workshop, the participants tell their story through different art-based exercises, developing a lifeline articulated around important events, identifying physical and emotional effects of trauma, and how to show these on the body. Such an exercise places the torture, rape, or illness within the larger context of each person's life. As the participant work on their maps, it brings a greater understanding to the psychological trauma as well as their visible scars, enabling a more holistic understanding of their own past. The body maps are progressively created and populated with these stories of physical and psychological suffering, as well as resilience. The maps are then shared among the participants and narrated. This process takes the individual story and puts them into a larger context, demonstrating a pattern of abuse and repression which took place under the Moi regime. It also enables a victim to consider the commonality and articulating themselves as a coherent group. When the participants agree, the maps are then displayed in public, and the participants share their testimonies. Despite the intentions to declare the place a heritage site, the Kenyan government has backed down despite petition from survivors' organization. Local human rights and victims' organizations argue that the government's reluctance to declare the site a heritage site is related directly to the truth-telling potential of a site. On July the 21st, 2010, 21 victims of torture and unlawful detention won a high court case against the state and were granted compensation of a total of 40 million Kenyan shillings. The decision was groundbreaking in that the compensation was granted outside the Kenyan Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Committee process, though the decision was made primarily because the case was lodged before the formation of that commission. In this case, the participants of the body mapping workshop did not display maps in a larger exhibition, but reunited a year later after making their body maps to evaluate the workshop. The group decided to go back to Nyayo House for a small ceremony, during which cleansing rituals were performed. The victims did a silent walk through the cells, as well as a lighting of candles ceremony. These were a symbol of healing for the survivors, as well as a way to show the light, truth, and bring healing to others around the survivors. The workshop allowed them to talk about their experience of torture victims and to share these stories with their families. In Afghanistan, the testimonies of victims of human rights abuse have been central to develop theater pieces. Afghan artists have used different techniques such as playback theater and theater of the oppressed to share victims' stories. Community-based theater is most closely identified with Brazilian theater director Augusto Boal and his Theater of the Oppressed, which launched an international movement using his techniques as a vehicle for participatory social change. Gold developed a process whereby audience members, so-called spect actors, can stop a performance and assume a protagonist's role on stage to change the dramatic action, propose various solutions, and discuss plans for change and train themselves for social action. Playback theater is another widely used technique in community-based theater. Developed in the United States in 1975, this method enables an audience member to tell a story from her or his life and then watch as actors and musicians immediately recreate the scene, giving it artistic shape and coherence. The assumption here is that when memories are told and retold, they go beyond the original boundaries of the individual storyteller's space, time, and body, and are relocated in the mind and the bodies of the performance and the audience. By telling, watching, and even participating in a performance, the experiences of others become collective. And while this cannot recreate by any degree of accuracy the emotional scope of generalized mass violence, it can give the audience the feeling of actually being there, providing a space for shared memory. In Afghanistan, after more than 3 decades of violent conflict with millions of victims, accountability for massive human rights abuses remains elusive, while the voices and stories of the victims continue to be silenced and therefore unacknowledged. Community-based theater has proved successful in ways of breaking the silence about issues concerning past and present human rights violation in the country. The Afghan organization ARDO has used playback theater and theater of the oppressed as a means of documenting people's personal stories and their experiences of loss and war. Theater creates space for the victims of Afghanistan to come together and analyze the past in the context of the present and enable them to become active protagonists in shaping a more peaceful and just Afghanistan. Using playback theater, ARDO developed a play called Infinite Incompleteness. Afghan victims from different parts of the country were invited to share their experience of war. Over the course of 20 performances, approximately 120 stories were told, and a total of 10 stories were carefully selected, linguistically edited, and arranged in a basic storyline that takes into consideration Afghanistan's ethnic and linguistic diversity. The 3 main national languages are spoken by characters during the performances. It also takes into account different parts of the conflict starting from 1978 to the present, as well as promoting both male and female voices. These real accounts were complemented by a parallel storyline consisting of a series of fictional actions. Infinite Incompleteness premiered on the Human Rights Day in 2010 at the Lycée Esticlal in Kabul. It has since been performed for larger audiences in various parts of Afghanistan. The play was also shown in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. HRDO continues to use community-based theater in its transitional justice and memorialization work, incorporating in to its Memory Boxes exhibition.
امید کجاستی؟ هر جا را می‌بالم تو را نمی‌بینم. امید همه می‌پرسند چند سال هستی؟ 3 سال است. 2 سال کوچکتر از رویا بود.
The last methodology I will talk about today are the memory boxes. The memory boxes represent a form of small personal museum, as well as a memorial built and curated by the family members in order to remember and commemorate the person they have lost. A memory box is built as a small and portable wooden box and created by the family members of a victim in order to store significant objects and belonging of the loved one they have lost during the conflict and violence. Inspired by the South African project mentioned before and adapted to the Afghan context, the creation of a memory box involves a psychosocial process conducted in the form of a workshop. The memory box are produced as a result of an aesthetic process conducted by a trained facilitator who leads the participant through a variety of artistic games and exercises to a path of storytelling. Participants are chosen in order to represent different communities and regions. As part of the exercise is to foster understanding among those communities, promoting reconciliation. Each participant can choose which moments of their lives they wish to focus on and how to represent these moments in their personal boxes using specific images and objects. The process usually takes 3 to 5 days and includes a full day of trust and group building exercises, as well as activities that foster the participants' gradual discovery of their own creative capacity. All exercises are used to foster dialogue. Initial discussions centered on war and peace in Afghanistan, while the participants share their personal stories and experience. Eventually, the focus shifts to make it the individual memory boxes. Under the guidance of the facilitator, but with full autonomy and ownership, the participants create their own boxes consisting primarily of personal objects, which often belong to their deceased family member, such as copies of the Quran, wedding certificates, jewelry given by a late husband, photos of deceased children, letters, identity cards. In addition, during the creative process, participants produce further artistic creation related to their life stories. Often these include poems, photographs of their current life situation, or paintings. Another important element is the creation of a personal timeline. This process involves the participants sketching their entire life journey on paper with colored pens, crayons, and paint, highlighting significant events in their lives. The participants are also asked to reflect on the national flag of Afghanistan. The national flag carries an important symbolic value, as it has changed with each new regime capturing the capital Kabul, and thus a flag is often attached to a very painful personal loss. To reflect this, the participants are asked to paint the flag, which is the most significant in their own life story, and then proceed to draw a second one that reflects an ideal Afghanistan. All the personal objects and artistic artifacts that have been created and gathered, participants are then invited to set up their own personal museum. They assemble and curate their memory boxes in the most aesthetic and artistic manner, ready for display. The participants are also asked to prepare a brief verbal presentation they will use to explain the content of their box. The aesthetic process concludes with a final walk through a symbolic museum of memory boxes, followed by a closing circle in which the participants share their last thoughts and feelings about the experience of the workshop. Once the creation completed, the memory boxes are presented publicly. The family of the victim acts as a guide, explaining to the visitors the significance of the objects presented in the box. The process of creating the box and sharing them with the public is both painful as well as emotionally demanding for the participants involved. Despite this strain, many of the participants recognize the healing benefit as well as the importance of having their story heard. Using art-based memorialization in the form of body mapping, community-based theater, or memory box, victims and survivors are empowered to work on and conceptualize their own memory projects within a group. It creates a safe space and opportunity to highlight their voices and experience as victims and survivor. Also, they create a timeline of the violence, demonstrating that all the different regions and all the different groups and communities have been touched by different stages of conflict. When other transitional justice mechanisms fail due to the lack of political will, memorialization work offer a window into the lives of victims, where they explore personal histories through a reflective creative process, resulting in the creation of physical spaces of remembrance and memory. In doing so, individual memories and narrative can be understood from a collective perspective, as they contribute to a more collective truth-telling endeavor and healing process. Today, as we struggle for more social justice around the world, what is the role of institutions such as museums in these struggles? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching and listening to this video. This presentation is part of the Art and Humanities seminar series organized by the Red Cross Museum in Geneva. I would like to share with you my PowerPoint presentation. The title of my speech today is Remaking Art as an Aid, drawing on the aesthetics and ethical engagement of artists in post-blast Beirut. This presentation focuses on the art collectives and artistic creations that have emerged in the aftermath of the 4th August explosion. Some of the areas close to the explosion were a vibrant hub for all artists from different backgrounds, hosting extraordinary range of creative and cultural activities in Beirut. The explosion of Beirut's port hence attacked the very heart of the cultural community. More than 100 museums, galleries, and artist studios were severely damaged. Almost all the capital's theater spaces and venues were damaged and some severely ruined. The blast, therefore, did not only lead to physical, but an aesthetic destruction of the city. The current situation in Lebanon reflects the collapse of various structures. The devastating explosion happened amid the COVID-19 global pandemic and economic pressures rooted in the failure of the political system. Lebanon is also dealing with the impacts of massive refugee flows and high levels of violence in the neighboring country. The blast also sent psychological shockwaves through the city, generating widespread trauma within a population all too familiar with political crisis. In response to this multi-layered crisis, dozens of creative initiatives and many artistic and musical performances have emerged, shedding light on the crucial contribution of cultural and artistic initiatives in the aftermath of the blast. This presentation provokes reflection on a critically under-examined experience of artists in the humanitarian context. The motivation for this research comes from the fact that despite the huge impact of artists and cultural workers in time of crisis, there is a little recognition for their work and among policymakers, funders, and humanitarian organizations. The purpose of the research is to explore how arts and creativity reshape the humanitarian context and whether the work of artists can address humanitarian issues in ways that differ markedly from those offered by humanitarian workers and practitioners. As we read on the wall of a destroyed theater in Beirut, we want bread, education, and theater. The research aims to highlight ways in which art can act as a critical intervention in humanitarian context. To do so, I approach the emerging artistic engagements through the critical lens of humanitarian action. Humanitarianism is defined as the imperative to assist fellow human beings and to alleviate suffering without necessarily acting to defend violated rights. It is perceived to be apolitical, neutral, and impartial. The critical lens of humanitarian action, which I adopt, questions this presumed separation of humanitarianism from institutional politics. It also challenges the tendency of humanitarianism to depoliticize and dehistoricize the structural and political causes of the suffering it seeks to address. Following the blast, a group of more than 100 theater practitioners gathered over a conversation in a WhatsApp group and formed the Theater Relief Group Initiative. They made an open invitation called Beirut No Show Tonight and invited people to make a donation by purchasing a ticket. The call created transnational connection with the outside world. It found powerful online presence among theater global community and was supported by more than 36 international institutions. Farah Wardani, the co-founder of the initiative, says we need to preserve theater in a time when the city is losing its identity. Theater is the only way to safeguard the truth, to spread it, and to bring life back to our city. Putting emphasis on the importance of protecting theater and culture in times of crisis, Karim Dakroub says we must do something because generally theater and culture are the first to be affected by huge crises and are the last to recover from them. Sharing about his motivation to join the initiative, Fadi Abi Samra says, I took part in the initiative because we don't want to lose the soul of the city. Because in the end, a city without theater, literature, and exhibition is a city that cannot breathe. The next initiative I would like to speak about is To Beirut initiative. It was an initiative organized by Sukak Theater Collective in forms of providing relief grants for individuals working in the performing arts after Beirut port explosion. It was meant to support the existence and sustainability of the performing arts sector in Lebanon through direct monetary support to artists and practitioners who were affected on the personal and professional level. Marian Kurtbani, a cultural practitioner and communication coordinator at SOCAG, says at the time hopelessness had prevailed and many artists were considering to leave the country, we get together to create opportunity for artists to stay in Lebanon. We wanted to share our assets with one another and to transmit knowledge to emerging artists. In her view, it is the responsibility of the artist to create a system embedded in critical thinking. In a country like Lebanon, where art is always carrying social and political impact, the art becomes a reflection of what's happening on the ground. At that level and in such times, the responsibility of the artist is to provide humanitarian institutions with creative imaginations. Artists shall keep creating and create new systems that embody the critical thinking. Drama Therapy was another initiative held by SOCAG. Participants were invited to an embedded exploration to resensitize themselves and reconnect with their personal thoughts, fears, and desires. Placing psychosocial support and social and emotional learning at the heart of their practice, SOCAG created a series of drama therapy sessions with the aim of releasing excessive tension and stress. The next initiative is the relief shows organized by Clown Me In. Clown Me In is a clown initiative co-founded by Sabine Choquer from Lebanon. They reach communities through street performances, and their mission is to offer people ways to deal with difficulties through art, laughter, and capacity building. Following the blast and through their global fundraising, they were able to provide direct relief support and of over $10,000, and they organized a 15-day comic relief tour to provide psychosocial relief in the most affected areas. Clown and activism may seem like an odd couple, but embedded in the nature of clown in the spirit of joy and resistance to oppressive forces. The next initiative is the Laban Playback Theater. Laban Playback Theater uses ideas from the theater of the oppressed to enable participants speaking up and a chance to shape and telling their stories. The members of Laban went to street right after the crisis, helped cleaning the damaged building and providing aid. And further, they contributed to the art and creative therapies through playback. The playback sessions were organized on monthly sessions. They were organized online, and they were also provided to members of different NGOs who had been affected and were dealing with traumas. Rihla Ila was a street parade by Zairakun Collective. Zairakun Collective organized a number of parades and performances to open up a space for residents and neighborhoods and to create venues for conversation and platform for freedom of speech. It was very important, in the words of Rami, who was one of the founders of the initiative, to have the communication with the street and for art to be very open and accessible to the public, giving the communities a chance to be involved. After the blast, the disappointment had exceeded. Everyone felt they wanted to leave the country, but crisis opened new opportunities. In thinking of art as an aid, Rami believes art embodies our values, rituals, and cultures. Art is not an aid, it is our essential culture. Artists permeate the culture of society, goes inside and helps society to find its culture, develop it, and criticize it. Without art, our culture is falling. Art is beyond aid. Art is a matter of letting the human circle breathe and build connection. At the end of the day, connection is the prerequisite of rebuilding and reconstruction. On the question about art addressing humanitarian situation, number of artists have shared their reflection. Dima Nashawi believes in a situation like Beirut, art cannot just be for the sake of art. Art in the end is a tool to make a statement against a certain political or social situation. At a time where truth gets lost due to the diversity of narratives, art remains the key of a genuine documentation to what is happening in reality and becomes a way to archiving the stories born due to the humanitarian situation. Mona Neo believes theater allows the audience members to sit next to each other without bothering about the identity of the people around them. It provides a democratic practice and a statement of activism. Farah Wardani believes art-based work helps building resilience and connection, as well as empathy among human cultures. Theater plays a big role. It facilitates critical thinking among the community and opens a space to think and share. In the absence of actual democracy in Lebanon, in the time where situations get more critical, theater and art create a democratic approach of gathering. The artists have also reflected on the challenges in times of crisis. The main issue will always be the funds. Marian Kurtbani believes with limited number of funding bodies, the demand is always much more than what's available. Funders also have certain political agendas, which makes it difficult for artists to create a work of art based on their own interest. Restrictions set by COVID-19 integrating technology into performance, especially in a context of Lebanon where the electricity and network supply is very much restricted, are among the main challenges. Mona Neo believes we live in a culture that lacks support towards art. The problem is that art is perceived as a form of luxury. In her view, art is an act of self-expression and hence is a need and not luxury. Farah Wardani mentions about the human resource problems that their initiative was affected by due to the blast itself, and Hanan Haj Ali refers to the censorship and disapproval of the scripts when it comes to the theater practitioners. Art enabling reconstruction, the artists reflect. Rami believes reconstruction happens when the artist finds a moment of opportunity in the moment of crisis. It happens when rethinking the future becomes possible. Art provides different types of thinking, different approaches and experimental tools. Reconstruction is about reconstructing social bonds. Dima Nashavi, reflecting on her work as a clown, says, reconstruct laugh. What clown me is doing is reviving laughs among people through street performance. Hisham Jabber believes we are in need of rebuilding a new human before rebuilding a new city. We need to build a new culture and new mind. And Farah Wardani believes art is surely capable of doing so, of shaping new identities. Marian challenges the idea of art enabling reconstruction. In her view, art enables deconstruction. And the deconstructing idea is what is needed to reestablish the social standards. Deconstructing the ideas becomes the infrastructure to a proper reconstruction, which is needed for societies, especially in the current humanitarian situation. Reflecting on the reconstruction experience, Nadia Hassan believes a lot of reconstruction needs to be done on the psychosocial level, including trauma work and healing. Therefore, theater is such a critical site for the intervention. It offers a platform to engage in a conversational rather than confrontational manner. The collective act of creating also helps us to constitute a new world, a new life, and a new society. In Rami's word, reconstruction is about using artistic tools and methods to assemble a new world. It is about coming out of the crisis together. Reconstruction is about recreating a culture. Mona New believes art, as a matter of fact, is the closest experience of getting in touch with who we are and reconnecting with human beings. Rethinking artistic activism through a humanitarian lens, the humanitarian situation has witnessed emergence of new forms of arts. We see in the context of Beirut, with theater spaces destroyed, the city has become a stage and the performance has become a space for collective connecting of bodies to one another. Among the most important functions theater has performed in this context is to inspire and encourage empathy and solidarity, contributing to the individual and group elaboration of trauma and memory. We can notice that on the one hand, artists seem to have acted as new humanitarian actors, alleviated suffering, while on the other hand, they have challenged and disputed their government's policies or lack of in dealing with major sociopolitical crises. While artists have not been involved in conventional politics, such as advocacy and rallying, but they have established more horizontal relations of solidarity with marginalized communities. In comparison to the politicizing tendency of humanitarian action, almost all artists interviewed have shared about their political motivations and acknowledged the political dimension of their activities. In their views, humanitarian crises are embedded in underlying issues of poverty, vulnerability, and political failure. And doing art, more than anything, is about positioning yourself politically. In comparison to humanitarian organizations, artistic initiatives have created non-hierarchical grassroots or interactions that provide opportunities for survivors to act as an active agents. These initiatives have moved beyond the humanitarian action and have been understood through the lens of subversive humanitarianism, a kind of humanitarian activity which is driven by moral and political consideration. These initiatives would tell us there is hope for a new future, and Beirut's art would tell us how the city might be rebuilt. But let us remember, the artists today need more support than ever. Like everyone else, they suffer from shock, despair, and a huge sadness for the lives and spaces that have been lost. Most of the artists, they have been affected hugely and have lost their livelihoods and have been forced to withdraw from the creative sector. Let's remember, without artists, the city will not heal. As Alaminavi says, let us stand by our fellow artists so they can stand on their feet, so they can inspire us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're well. My name is Gilles Furtwängler. I'm a poet and a visual artist living between Lausanne, Switzerland, and Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm here to invite you to participate in a collective artwork. I, myself, mainly work with words, text that I write, but also with found text, found words that I hear and read in my daily life. I then turn these sentences into poems to be read. They are also printed on posters or tarps, painted or turned into sculptures. I'm interested by writing and retelling what I hear, to give it back through art pieces. Our everyday words and thoughts, ways of speaking, of thinking, of learning, of evolving. For the ones who are interested to participate, I'm inviting you to share with me on a guest book page some of your notes, comments, or feedback on the topics presented today. Engaging. To be more precise, if needed, I have 3 questions. What are your thoughts following today's presentations? Did you participate or did you hear about projects engaging art as a tool in humanitarian work? If yes, could you tell me a bit about your memories? Thank you. It's pretty simple to participate. You just need to click on this link and you will be directed to a page where you will be able to post your feedback and comments. My proposition is to build with your words a text around the topics of this symposium. The text will be then designed and published in the book following this symposium. Every contributor will be credited or can decide to stay anonymous. Feel free to give your feedback as if it was a guest book, an ID box, a common brainstorming, or a complaints office. It can be keywords, critical thoughts, long paragraph, short ones. All is accepted. There is also a video uploading option for those who prefer to talk. I am really looking forward to discovering your contribution and working with them. I thank you very much for your participation. I'm wishing you a good afternoon. Thank you. The link below the video is available from now and will stay active until end of June 2021.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would first like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to share here some ideas with you. I've always felt that studying the past is interesting because it gives us tools to think about the present and to create a better future. So I am very grateful to be able to present examples here of how ancient Greek theater can be used to help people in difficult situations. About 2.5 millennia ago, ancient Greeks gathered on the slope of the Acropolis in Athens to attend performances of tragedies in which various characters were depicted as going through traumatizing experiences. Countless plays offered their audiences stories of exile, of cities destroyed by war, or of people experiencing such difficulties that they saw no other way out than committing suicide. Family drama, murder, and violence also feature at the heart of many of these tales, usually taking place in a distant mythological past. As early as the 4th century BC, the philosopher Aristotle understood that such spectacles had a cathartic effect. Tragedy was linked to the experience of pity and fear and allowed for a sort of distancing or purification from such strong emotions. Today, ancient Greek tragedies are still regularly used as an art form for humanitarian purposes in various contexts and situations. Attending and/or actively taking part in performance of such ancient plays helps people in personal or humanitarian crisis because they can identify with the characters of the stories and what they go through. The ways in which fictional characters express what they feel resonates with what people in similar situations nowadays still feel. In this talk, I will first present two different initiatives in which ancient Greek tragedy is used to help people, before discussing a number of questions specifically linked to the use of ancient theater in such contexts. The first initiative I would like to briefly present here takes the shape of a theater company, Theater of War Productions, created in 2009. Its director, Brian Juris, has successfully used theater, and very often ancient Greek theater and tragedies in particular, as a tool to help people and groups who experience various extremely difficult life situations: street violence, domestic violence, addictions, tensions between communities and police forces, racism, sexual violence, to name but a few. But I will focus here on a particular project: the use of ancient Greek tragedy as a tool to help army veterans return to civil life. The 2020 US National Veteran Suicide Prevention Report indicates that in 2018, the average number of veterans who commit suicide per day was between 17 and 18. Already looking for a way to help this particular population in the previous years, Brian Juris had found in an ancient Greek tragedy a particularly relevant tool. In a play composed by the tragedian Sophocles in the 5th century BC, one of the most important heroes of the Trojan War, Ajax himself, takes his own life after an episode of deep mental illness, resulting in the violent slaughter of animals, accompanied by feelings that he cannot save his honor and that death is the only solution for him. Interactions between the suffering soldier and his wife, partner, and their son are also depicted in the play in many details, making of it a detailed tableau of the type of feelings and difficulties soldiers returning to civil life might experience. Events organized by Brian Juris' company usually consist in a public performance where professional actors read a translation of the play to their audience and then organize and facilitate dialogue with this audience. Everyone is encouraged to express their feelings, the emotions they experienced while watching the performance. Thus, although the soldiers, or former soldiers rather, are not usually directly involved in the acting process, they nonetheless actively take part in the event. They are not mere spectators. Countless testimonies of veterans show that what the character in the play experiences exactly echoes their own thoughts and feelings. For example, doubts about the ability to come back to civil life, the dark feeling of possibly being a danger to their family, the idea that one maybe does not deserve to come back to normal human life after having lived in violence for a long time, and sometimes feelings of shame or of betrayal, depending on what experiences was lived during service time. A retired army commander said, I quote, "The first time I heard Ajax's speech, it knocked me back in my chair. It was me." Other veterans cried when listening to or reading some of Ajax's lines in the play. But how concretely did attending a performance of this ancient play help this particular population? After all, in the play, Ajax does indeed commit suicide, whereas the whole point of the initiative is the prevention of suicide among army veterans. Here again, the best way to discuss this, I think, is to rely on the testimonies of the veterans themselves. The idea that it made them realize that they were not alone in what they experienced, that many others in the audience had the exact same difficulties, seems to be a recurrent theme. Likewise, seeing themselves from an external point of view, that is, witnessing the suffering of the hero Ajax, while being conscious that it echoes their own suffering, was also mentioned as functioning as a wake-up call. More fundamentally, the performance of an ancient play detached from daily experience and contemporary concerns allowed and encouraged the members of the audience to freely express themselves, which was felt as very beneficial in a group where speaking of one's mental health or difficulties is sometimes taken as a sign of weakness. Let's now move to a very different context. The second initiative using ancient Greek theater for humanitarian purposes that I would like to present here focuses on Syrian exiled women. Now, several ancient tragedies have been used in the last few years to provide help to Syrian refugees in a variety of contexts and places. So I only present one here. It started a few years ago with director Omar Abu Sada staging a performance of The Trojan Women, originally a play from ancient Greek tragedian Euripides. So he staged a performance of The Trojan Women in Jordan with a cast of Syrian women. Linked to this performance was a movie entitled The Queens of Syria. So if you have your mobile phone handy, you can scan the QR code. It will direct you to the trailer. Otherwise, it's available freely on YouTube. The film was presented around the world and won numerous awards, contributing to public awareness about the life conditions of Syrian refugees. Euripides' Trojan Women is a play originally performed in Athens in the 5th century BC. The plot takes place in the aftermath of the Trojan War, just after the Greek allies destroyed the city of Troy. This play is somehow exceptional because instead of focusing on the winners, it focuses on the fate of the defeated Trojan women without sparing any detail about all the horrors they experience: the murder of their children, rape, the loss of their status and possessions, exile, and so on. There is something darkly troubling, to say the least, in realizing that such horrors echo what women in war contexts still experience today. But it is also what makes the ancient play a useful tool for humanitarian purposes. And director Omar Abu Sada understood that federating a group of Syrian women refugees around the performance of such a play would be a way to help them. The performance, however, was not simply a re-performance of the original play, nor even a mere adaptation. The director closely worked with the Syrian women to embed their own words and emotions into the performance, thus literally giving them a voice at a time when they felt no one was hearing or listening to them. The idea was to use a work of art created in a distant past, in a foreign culture, in a different place, as a tool, as a facilitator for women refugees to deal with their own experiences, share them with others, and create a new work of art. As in the previous projects, the gathering of the women around the project and their active participation in it helped them feel that they were part of a community again and could recover their individuality and power of action. The reactions of Syrian women involved into this project and in the Queens of Syria movie project emphasize the way in which the similarities between the content of the original play and their own experiences had helped them share their difficult emotions and feelings and ultimately take control of them. You can see on the screen some of what these women said about the play and the whole experience. To the eyes of the Syrian women, however, it is not only their own situation that mattered. They saw in the theatrical performance and on a larger scale, the creation of the movie, a way of sharing their cry for help, a cry addressed to fellow human beings to consider them as part of humanity. Ancient Greek theater as an art form offers many advantages as a humanitarian tool. As works of art coming from the past, Greek tragedies are somehow disconnected from contemporary realities. They provide a safe space from which to think about difficult situations one might experience. The cultural and chronological distance act as filters and allow both actors and audience to conceptualize and observe suffering, including their own, from an external point of view, as it is reflected in what fictional characters experience. Painful experiences are suddenly projected into a distant and fictive past, which create a protective barrier between oneself and this suffering. Suffering is projected onto the stage. It can now be observed from a more detached point of view. It is quite interesting to note here that this distancing technique was actually already used by ancient Greeks. Indeed, the plot of the vast majority of the tragedies, at least the one we still have, takes place in a sort of undefined, distant mythological past. However, theater is also a performative art in which actors and spectators become actively and physically involved. This might sound paradoxical, given what has just been said about ancient theater as functioning as a way to put distance between oneself and painful experiences. But by becoming performers themselves, victims can experience suffering differently. By becoming actors playing the role of refugees, for example, actual displaced people can transform from victims experiencing suffering without active involvement to individuals who recover their power of action, their agency, and in a way control all the feelings of suffering. For a while, the emphasis is put not on their experiencing of suffering, but on their ability to depict it and communicate it to an audience. Here, the fact that those plays are ancient offers another advantage. There is no expectation that the text of the play should be a faithful translation or reproduction of the ancient one. Ancient tragedies can be freely adapted, modified, and so perhaps people involved in such projects feel even more free than with other types of artworks to include their own ideas and feelings into the performative experience. But once again, there is more to it than an individual journey from victim to actor. Taking part in staging a theater play allows people to enter a community as active participants, to play a role in a group. They are not just the outsiders at the margins of society who need help. They are integrated as individuals playing a role in a common project. They do not only become actors on stage, they become actors in a community. Through performances of ancient plays, the general audience, the theater professionals, the refugees, the veteran soldiers, for example, are federated around a common project where each has their role to play and which is a door open towards reintegration within society. Remains now to discuss two aspects of this use of ancient Greek theater that require some more considerations. The first obvious question that arises when distressed people are invited to actively participate in a performance where characters go through the same kind of suffering as themselves is the following one. How to balance in a safe way the involvement in the acting process and the vulnerability of the victims. How to help victims become actors without having them go through the same pain again. Experiencing suffering again may be part of a therapeutic process, but there is indeed always the risk with the mediums such as theater, where participants, both actors and audience, are so closely involved into the performance that the distance provided by the theatrical medium and the fact that the play belongs to a distant past is not enough to provide a safe environment to go through trauma again. And indeed, sometimes participants in such projects have to leave because some elements of the plays are too close to their own experiences, and leaving them again, even if only fictionally, is too painful. If we come back to the ancient Greek tragedies used in the context of help offered to population not necessarily familiar with this type of art, another question must be considered: cultural differences. So this is, of course, a very complex and delicate question, and it will not be possible here to unpack all its implications. Let me just draw your attention here to a couple of points. It is important, I think, to be aware of the underlying risk of somehow imposing external cultural and aesthetic norms onto people whose cultural background is different. One of the ways to avoid this pitfall is to build the humanitarian project around the notion of dialogue and welcome and elicit active input from the participants into the creation of the performance, as it has very well been done in the Syrian Women Project. Ideally, then, humanitarian projects using ancient Greek theater should carefully balance the original contents of the plays, which, as we have seen, provide a useful distance to the world of the people helped, and the modifications brought to this content, and also to the performative aspects, in a way that allows the process of encouraging distressed people to become agents and actors again. It is really a matter of striking the right balance here. To conclude, let me ask a final question, perhaps the most obvious one that must be raised when discussing the value of art as a tool for humanitarian purposes. Is art really what people in difficult situations need? Are there no other much more pressing concerns than offering art to displaced populations, for example? The answer seems obvious, but also deserves further considerations. Of course, there would be something indecent about thinking that Art alone may solve the worst trauma through which people in need of humanitarian help go. No one thinks that theater is going to literally feed people or provide required medical help or shelter. However, the fact that art is not always understood as a basic need is a crucial element in itself. In situations where life is reduced to a constant struggle to meet those basic needs, people can sometimes feel dehumanized. They might feel that they have lost everything that would qualify their life as human. That is, for example, a sense of belonging in a community, the ability, the security to share and express ideas and feelings, the understanding that their own individuality matters, their agency. Giving them the possibility to experience art again, whether actively or as spectators, listeners, give them back important elements of life which are not taken care of through other forms of help sometimes. It is, of course, not a matter of distracting people from their suffering. Art is not just a form of entertainment. It is a door to the most specific characteristics of what makes us human beings. Using art as a humanitarian tool may not help people physically survive, but it functions as an invitation back into humanity, addressed to everyone who might feel left out. Thank you.
It's go time for you guys.
Yeah, we're on?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, hello everyone. Hello again. Thank you for all these panels. And yeah, we were asking something about how can art help humanitarian situations? Is it worth it? And yeah, I wanted to ask you about would art be a safe space for these people? You, Sophia, you showed us this body mapping situations. We heard about with Azadeh this theatrical situation on the street. improvising, gathering people in this very difficult post-blast situation. And also with Elodie and the Syrian women I was thinking of. How would you say that art or culture in these situations could be a safe space?
Shall I start?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I'm gonna have a bit of a sort of a half answer. I think art has really the potential of being a safe space, but it has to be facilitated in a proper way. I think people that work with the body mapping, when you get victims to work with body mapping, for example, or the memory boxes, you always have a facilitator, and that's really a central point, because you cannot, there's a real risk of re-traumatization, and I think probably when we talk about the theater, it's the same case of when you just put victims in front of these narratives, in front of these stories that are very powerful, there's a real risk of re-traumatization. So I mean, it really shows that art is very powerful, but it has to, it's not simply a safe space. It has to be moderated and facilitated to enable victims to enter their creative capacity in a way to then engage into, so art becomes a safe space. So that's from my perspective and experience.
Azadeh, what would you say?
Thank you for this opportunity. Reflecting on the experience in Beirut and from what I've learned from the artist, I could say that the art has provided everyday space of activism in the marginalized spaces. Like you have a city which has been ravaged by conflict, by years and years of civil war, by recent political crisis and tensions, economic crisis, refugee influx. So you have communities that have been internally and externally displaced, and these communities have never felt they have a public space that they can belong to. So art has provided these communities a space to feel they are connected to and they belong to, thanks to the artistic expressions and initiatives, particularly in the last experience in Karantina, which is one of the areas in Beirut which is very marginalized in terms of being on the margin of the city, in terms of economic, in terms of political, and in terms of humanitarian issues. And you see the dozens of activism through art happening in that area. So in a way, I think art has provided a space for activism, and it has provided an alternative way for understanding conflict and resolution. When I talk about conflict, I mean the multi-layered aspect of conflict and what conflict means for people of Beirut today.
So maybe not a safe space, but a space of activism, expression, living through the trauma. And Elodie, would you say that, because you've been all talking about theater, and as Sophia said, we need in this kind of situations, we need many people helping or being there as you said, facilitators. Who are these people? What are their role and professions?
Well, I guess there is space for a wide range of people and professions. I think, obviously, when you talk about theater and you want to facilitate the creation of a new performance, you might need a director, you might get the help from professional actors, for example, to train the people who will be involved in the performance. But going back to the previous question, this idea of finding the balance between, healing and re-traumatizing the people, I think it would be good to have people who are trained in psychological help as well. Perhaps especially in the case of theater, because it really involves deep emotions and the body as well, the physical activity of going again through something you had gone through before. So yeah, I think the more people you have involved into this, the better you might be able to find the right balance. And going back to what Azadeh was saying about using art as a safe space for, or at least as a space for activists, hopefully a safe one. Yeah, perhaps it might be worth involving other people as well in those kind of uses. I'm not sure, perhaps Azadeh, you have an idea of who could perhaps provide help to do it in a safe way.
If I may interrupt, I would very much agree with having a community expert who knows more about the history of traumas in the community, as well as facilitators from outside, because at times we find that experts, even with a good intention coming from outside, wouldn't necessarily know the history of traumas and the cultural ways of traumas, because we very well know that traumas and the way people absorb traumas and pain are very cultural. So we have to understand the way people culturally express that. And that's very much part of an experience of an artist. So even though most artists are not as psychologists in that sense, but because they are very well grounded in their community's culture of expression, they can be of help. I think that will give us another way of looking at the value of art and the role of artists in times of crisis.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Maybe, Philippe, you could describe a little bit more about who are there helping, who are these people in the teams, and are they informed? How difficult is it for them to help in different situations, cultures? How do they learn?
Yeah, I'm just fascinated by the discussion and the presentation by our three colleagues. There are so many notions that indeed are involved, or that we try as a Humanitarian organization to include in our activities, and the cultural dimension that you mentioned, which is to be careful of not using something that is imported from another country that wouldn't work because people might not be at ease to speak in public. And one of the presenters mentioned the idea of having actors playing some of the roles, which allows people to put a little bit of distance. The question of re-traumatizing people is also very, very important for us, because that's something we really don't want, but also using it as a way to engage different population through a different way. And I will give you just one example of something we are using, if I can use this word using, but that we have tried in several contexts, is participatory theater in the framework of sexual violence. And in some of the countries where we work, we know that the whole community has a role to play in helping victims to go back around on their normal lives. So we start with prevention on trying to explain what is wrong, what is not acceptable somehow, but in the language that the people speak, with local theater troops. And also, this is always accompanied by psychosocial workers, by social assistants, and so on. And the play is only an excuse to further go, for example, on the question of reintegrating some of the victims in the communities, because very often they are pushed on the side, and they they can't go back in their villages, for example. So these elements are very interesting the way you present it, because it totally makes sense of some of the initiatives we are trying. I think we are still at the early stage, and I don't think we have managed to get to the full potential of what the three of you have described.
Yeah, fascinating. Pascal, as a museum director, how did you consider the role of the museum and this kind of healing potential, or would be your museum or the so-called the Red Cross Museum in Geneva different, acting differently from another abroad? And
Thanks, that's a very good question, and thanks to all the speakers as well from my side. I mean, I couldn't be more inspired. I think it's a very complex question. I don't know if the International Red Cross Museum approaches it any differently than others, but one thing I can share with you in the privileged context of peaceful Geneva is, you know, one or two of the driving questions I have, which start always with the fact that I think it's important to acknowledge that the museum is a symbol of power and has been seen as one. It's the power of knowledge, it's the power of, it's often been seen as a top-down structure. We tell you and we are experts and you come here to learn. And just acknowledging that and then trying to deconstruct that idea is the first step towards playing an active role, perhaps, in society. And that goes by welcoming people, but not just in terms of, you know, communications, really welcoming everybody, acknowledging everybody's diversity and making feel everyone legitimate and actively welcome to engage in a conversation. That's the first thing. And then it means listening, listening to what the knowledge visitors bring with them, and not acknowledging that this knowledge is as important as any expertise that can be developed in the museum, and that our expertise must be to organize a conversation. And if we do get there, and if we do manage to create that safe space in the sense that we all are on the same level and trying to start a conversation, then perhaps we can start what I strongly believe in, and other speakers will talk about later on in the symposium, this idea of transformative learning, that the museum can be an opportunity to acknowledge your own ways of thinking, your own biases, your own projections, and opening up to another point of view, another perspective. And then what happens after that can be very, very interesting and very helpful. I mean, I remember working with migrants in the previous museum where I used to work, and positioning the museum as an anchor point for them to develop their social ecosystem. It took a lot of curating this moment and making sure everybody felt safe and okay, and the conversations that sparked through the artworks, through the exhibitions were incredible. But it takes a lot of being there with people and being very humble. And I think it can apply to anybody, whether you're a migrant or not. It can trigger important things. So yeah, I strongly believe that museums can be active agents in this way. But it starts with deconstructing the notion that the museum is not a scary temple of knowledge. Well, I think
thank you. Yeah. So culture as a conversation space, as a transformation space, as a community space. Yeah, very interesting. I will open the discussion. Maybe you have questions to one another, and just feel free to ask. And yeah, this is a conversation space.
I would have one question for all the speakers, is your view on the role of artists or art spaces in coping with the current pandemic and recovering from it, how art and artists can play an active role in helping us through this or not. I don't know how you think about it in your countries or through your specific field of expertise. Azadeh, oops, there's an echo coming from me. I'll switch my mic. Just feel free to jump in. Sophia, Elodie, how can art help us through the pandemic?
Well, I'll jump in. I think sort of coming back to what you said also, Pascal, about the role of the institution. I think this is now, critical to look at an institution of power, as you call it, which is the museum, and how it can respond to a crisis. And I think you mentioned it before, it is really opening the doors of such institutions, museums, to different groups and to the community that surrounds the museum. So collecting oral history, for example, collecting objects, things like that, to help to be the first, in a way, the first responder to a crisis, and then to also discuss how do we memorialize, and then further down the line, how do we commemorate? I mean, that's been a question, not about the pandemic, but in Afghanistan, the organization I work with regularly have a problem about how they memorialize the constant terrorist attacks they have. In practice, there's a terrorist attack, the journalists turn up, the firefighters, first responders turn up and clean the scene and erase everything and erase all the traces of the event. And so that's the question of the organization then comes in, picks up the objects that have been left behind and tries to collect the stories from people that have been witnessed. But over time, you have one traumatic event after the other that is basically erased every day. And so, that's a big question: is how do you work with these such traumatic events? So I don't have a real answer, but I think again that the museum has a crucial role to play.
Yeah, it's about narrative, telling a story and making it into the museum. But also when I heard, for example, Elodie telling these situations with the Syrian women, I think that the narration is very important, and how to put words, but also objects, and to understand what happened through these words or objects or gestures or dance or I don't know, play. And it's also, as you said, Sophia, and maybe Elodie too, it's putting a distance, but also keeping in touch, staying in touch. And there is this movement in both ways. And this is very interesting. And I think, yeah, what you said is absolutely true. The museum can be a collector of this moment when people are totally kept with their daily emergencies. We could try to see which objects has to stay into the museum and in our memories. Yeah,
I think that that's a very important point you are making, and the first question was very interesting to what art can bring in situations we are living now. I think art has something really essential that it's not essential. It sounds a bit paradoxical, but when our life, I mean, we can't really complain much in Switzerland because the situation has been less bad than in other countries, of course. But even in Europe, at some point, there was a lot of focus on essential activities. People were, you know, facing disease and death. And for quite a lot of people in European countries, it's not something you might think about a lot. So for a while, you know, non-essential activities such as art or museums were a bit put in the background, and you know, having them really exist and people at some point really demanded that art was, you know, a comeback from art, if you want, an opening of the museums again. And I think, yeah, that's bizarrely, art is essential because it's not essential. So it's what makes us human in a way. So yeah, that's what I thought.
Well, this is a beautiful sentence to in the end of this conversation. I would so yeah, it's time, but we still have time for last question, remark. If you want to say anything, Azadeh or Pascal, Philippe, feel free. It was such a pleasure to talk with you. I could stay for hours, but yeah.
I think for me, the most critical work of artists is to give meaning to life. In the midst of the destruction, in the midst of despair, in the midst of the loneliness, artists have been able to give us meaning to our daily experiences. Artists have been able to bring communities together through creative processes. And so many artistic initiatives that have been created through this last year and during the pandemic, they show us of the many ways artists can engage further to reconstruct and rebuild humanity. And I think they bring us back to who we are and they makes us more human.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. So yeah, as I said, it was a real pleasure to have you all together in this panel. We are having a next session of the symposium next Tuesday, same hour. And yeah, so just, yeah, have a nice evening and see you very soon. And thank you all.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.